In this third installment of the cherry video, we're going to open up our surfaced cherry and we're going to make two variations on it. So we're going to make the typical bent stem single cherry that you're used to seeing, and then we're also going to make the cliche double stem cherry that's so often depicted when you see the cherry with the two cherries and then the leaf hanging off of it. So what we're going to do to make this a little bit easier is we're going to add a spline deformer to our cherry stem to make it really easy to pose that stem and to move that around should we want to make any additional adjustments to it. It makes it very flexible way of working. So let's just jump back in here, and you want to open up your cherry scene file, or if you'd like to open mine, we're going to go into the video 6 and open up cherry 02. Now I can turn off these texture group. Now, like before, we're going to be moving things around, and the stem especially is textured using a gradient, and that is relative to the location of that gradient locator. So I think what I'm going to want to do before we jump into doing all of this is I'm going to bake that texture for the stem in, just to save us some headache later on. So I'm going to go into my stem, and I want to add a layer, image map, new image. We're just going to call this cherry stem, and this is going to be the diffuse on that. Yeah, that is probably just fine. Just accept the defaults on that one. So we don't want it to contribute to the baking. So we're just going to bake that. But before we do that, let's turn off the cherry and the leaf, because we don't want those to contribute to the baking either. Because that is, and the reason I say that is because they all use the same UV map called texture, so that has a tendency to overwrite. So if I just turn those off, they're not going to cause any problems. So with those objects turned off and this set to diffuse color on our cherry stem image, we're just going to right click on there and say bake to texture. You can see the amount of actual organic goodness all of those various layers were put in there. And another benefit of baking this out is the fact that it's also going to allow us to skip doing these calculations every time we do a render. So that's going to be just, even though the stem doesn't take up too much of the image, it's just going to make things a little bit faster. All right, cool. We're all done rendering that out. So we're just going to close that window there. We're going to go into our images here, and we want to right click on that. Just make sure to hit save. So when we created the image initially, we were just saving out a blank image. So to save the rendered result, we need to make sure to save that after we've calculated that. So now we can go in here and turn that back on. Now I'm going to save my scene. And we're going to go in here into video 7. I'm going to call that Cherry 03. So now we're going to create the rigging for our stem object, and that's going to require us to create a new object. So I'm going to hit in on there, and we're just going to draw a spline curve. And the reason I'm drawing the spline curve in there is for two reasons. First, our object isn't right there at the origin, and then it also gives us a little bit of control over the placement of where we're going to put those points. So I'm just going to get a left here. Now grab my spline tool. If you don't see this, you can right click and open up the pop-up and select curve. So with the tool active, we're just going to click right here slightly below our stem, and then we're just going to click slightly above the hump, and that's just going to create sort of like a safe area where it's not going to deform. We're going to leave those locators alone. Then we just want to sort of evenly space 3 more. So like 1, 2, and then making sure that we're above the geometry, click that third one there. So I'm going to hit Q to drop that tool. And just to make sure these are all evenly spaced, I'm going to grab these guys. And then I'm going to go into the vertex, and we're going to go to Align. We're just going to leave it Axis All and make those uniform. And then I'll evenly space those locators with the equal amount of space between each position. So hit my right bracket to select all of those now, and we're just going to set the position on the X to 0, and then set position to Z on the 0, just to make sure that that's nice and centered for us. Not super important that it does that, but we're going to do that anyways. So now we're going to go into polygons mode specifically, and then we want to switch into the setup workspace. Alright, so we're going to select our curve. Make sure to click and drag over the top of your curve. Select the stem. We're going to add this spline. Make sure to enable this Use Selected Mesh option, and then click OK. And then now it is deforming our stem. So that is the result that we want. So what we want to do, undo the moving of that guy. Is we want to take our cherry, and you see it's generated these locators. We want to parent those locators to our cherry object. So now when we move the cherry itself, you'll see it's going to be deforming the stem by moving around those locators all relative to that cherry. So that's going to allow us to rotate it and do all of those sorts of interesting things that we want to do. So it's just a very flexible way to do a little bit of procedural modeling on your object. So another thing we're going to adjust here is we want to, as you can see, as we drag this out, the stem actually gets longer. We want to take this spline deformer here, go into the Deformers tab, look at the spline effector, and we want to take this elastic value and we want to turn that back down to 0. And what that does is it keeps your object the same length. It doesn't stretch it out. And I think that is the actual result we want. Okay, so we're going to file save this object. And this is going to be our single cherry. So we're just going to create kind of a nice little arc here to our stem. Just selecting the items. And you might want to move this out a little bit. And that just gets it more of a natural looking stem. So hit Control S again. Excuse me. And we're just going to take a look at that in preview. So I think that's going to be our single cherry right there. So now we're going to go into close this guy up. And we're going to select all of these objects and hit Control G. And we're going to call this Cherry All 01. Now we're going to save this as a separate file. So I'm just going to call this Cherry 3B right over my existing file. And this is going to allow us to duplicate our cherry. So I'm just going to right click on that item in items list, and then I'm going to say duplicate hierarchy, and that should duplicate all of the objects in our scene. And from in here, figure out the direction we want to move this first. We're going to move the cherry itself and its stem, and the deformers and everything all came along for the ride. So let's rotate this a little bit. Let's look at our reference again. So when you see two cherries, I guess that little dimple, that little area there is kind of always facing opposite directions. So maybe that is how we'll do this. Kind of get that facing that way, that one facing that way. And then we're going to go to a local here so we can sort of rotate this in screen space. Rotate that one like that. Rotate there. So now it's just sort of posing this stem so that they meet up with each other. kind of keep an eye on all of the different angles on that. So it might be kind of hard to do this at that angle, so let's rotate him back some. Now we want this stem here to intersect with this one, but so we don't end up with two of these top parts, I think I'm going to select this here, go into polygons mode, and then I'm going to grow that selection with the shift up arrow. I'm going to delete that much of that stem. Now we just need to get these two guys to intersect. So go back into items mode by pressing 5, and we're going to start selecting some of these locators and see if we can't sort of pose these. W key just moving, and I have the select through option enabled, so you should be able to just sort of grab these guys and sort of tweak their position very easily without having to drop the tool each time. And if you feel you need to delete a little bit extra of that stem, go ahead. So I'm just going to continue to tweak this so that those two objects intersect in a pleasing manner. All right, I think that's actually pretty good. Now we can turn off all of these locators if we want. So we can say none and just show locators here. We can just turn those guys off visually for a second. And we can turn back on our leaf and position that guy. So I think I'm going to do that in a polygons mode. I think we also want to scale that down some. That's usually positioned right here up at the top of that stem area. So we got the camera view here. And we're going to save, Control S, open up our preview. And we can make some tweaks here, so no reason we can't turn on our locators again. Maybe take this guy and bend him over that way. Just looks more natural. And if you find that when you're doing deformations and previews not updating, you can just reset the preview there. Try to make that look like a little bit more of a natural arc. And go back into our perspective mode. How are we looking on this direction? Seems as though we've gotten a little bit off. Okay, so I think that is what we want to do. So I'm going to hit save. And for the ultimate flexibility, if you want to be able to go back and adjust this posing even more later on, I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to freeze this so that we can use this in the simulation and I don't have to worry about moving around all the locators and keeping all of that. So we're going to freeze the deformed position of it, but in order to make them so we can still edit them later on, we're just going to go back here and I'm going to save a third file on that. And I'm going to select the stems, the two stem objects, and then we're going to go to geometry, freeze, and then we want to freeze deformation, but we don't want to take the tessellation or the displacement on those. We click OK on that, and we should be able to delete these deformers now and all of these locators. And we can take all of these mesh item layers and we can merge those into a single object. I think our spline somehow came along for the ride. Delete that. I think our spline effector groups. And just to make sure, we're going to open up our preview. Make sure our cherry still looks like what we want. And there we go. There is our posed cherry. So in summary for this cherry, we basically baked in the texture for the stems to make sure that we could deform that without losing our surfacing. And then we created our own curve and applied that as a deformer, a spline deformer, to our object to allow us to pose our cherries. And then we were able to clone that and then position them relative to each other to get a more interesting double cherry layout. So in our next video, we're going to be tackling our strawberry. And then after that, we're going to be jumping into the packaging and the other aspects of setting up our scene.